In this module, we'll seek to understand both environmental and energy policy in the United States. We'll try to understand the history of government involvement in environmental and energy politics. We'll want to identify areas of conflict and consensus, and think about the major U.S. policies and their efforts to actually address some of the problems. So starting off, we ask, what does environmental politics actually address? And further, we need to think about the history of it and how it's evolved over time. Environmental politics and policy in the United States has evolved over time. For a significant period of history, we had a very narrow view about humans and how they related to their environment. This myopic approach was very much focused on the well-being of humans and how the environment ultimately impacted them. As such, to protect the well-being of humans in general, we need to protect the environment. And how do we do that? We did it through regulation of human behavior. This was a very heavy-handed approach at this point. Yet, as time went on, our understanding of humans' relationship with the environment evolved too. We have a greater understanding of the complexity of natural systems and human interactions with them. Today, we try to work with humans to get into a codependent, sustainable relationship with nature. What do you think of these two ideas? Protecting through regulation and sustainable development. Which one sounds better to you? Take a second and think through these. Hopefully, you come to the conclusion that both are acceptable. Because of how complex and interdependent our natural systems are, we need sustainable development. At the same time, we understand that individuals, and in particular their self-serving behavior, need to be regulated. So then, how do we define environmental policy? Well, if you think about those last two views of environmental policy, it helps us understand governmental actions. Well, these are things that affect the quality of the environment, very much on the modern, broader view, as well as the use of natural resources from the more narrow view. As such, because of this historical evolution of environmental policy, it tends to be very broad in scope. Yet, as we know because of the modern view, it's highly complicated and today very scientific. But because of this historical development, it's going to allow us to focus on three key areas, and in particular dealing with protection and sustainable development. We're going to be concerned with pollution, both control and protection, concerned with the use of natural resources and their protection, and finally thinking about energy usage as well as conservation. Because of how complex and expansive the policy is, it's viewed as being a wide net of both formal and informal actors. From all levels of government, across various types of interest groups, and individual constituents themselves, all hands on deck to deal with environmental politics. As such, we consider this process collaborative decision-making, or working together to make and implement environmental policy. Historically, because there were so many actors involved in this process, governments all across the board favored regulatory solutions to address environmental politics and policy problems. Doing so adopted almost a militaristic approach of command and control, whereby one level of government handed down a policy down to a lower level to ultimately implement the federal policies. So federal down to the states, states down to the local. This was a heavy-handed approach that fit very much into the narrow view of environmental politics. Yet, this heavy-handed approach has been softened by another major player, that is, the public. Over time, the public has become more involved with both casting opinions on environmental policy, as well as providing input into how they would like to see environmental policy shaped and carried out. So if you put this all together, there's been a long history of environmental policy in the United States. However, across that long history, it has evolved. The early focus of environmental policy through the 1960s was initially to stop the rapid overusage of resources. There was fairly wide consensus on this issue, and it was driven by the idea of the tragedy of commons. This is an idea where you have a shared resource, and individual users, acting independently according to their own self-interest, behave contrary to the common good of all users, and ultimately deplete or spoil that common resource. This consensus-oriented behavior progressed into the 1970s in trying to deal with pollution. We saw the creation of the EPA at this point. But moving into the 1980s, policy changed because of politics. We moved from consensus to conflict at this point. The EPA got its feet under it and started to address many problems facing the environment. Yet once it solved many blatant problems in the environment and society, views of the EPA started to shift and saw it as an overreach of government regulation and authority. Moving forward through time, we moved mostly into a period of gridlock and conflict. Partisanship and ideology restricted significant changes in environmental policy, and thus we adopted a more incremental approach to reforms. As we moved into the modern, broader view of environmental policy, we've shifted from domestic concerns to more global concerns and considered how the US actions interact with the world in a highly complex and interdependent environment.